On the morning of Monday, 2nd of October 1972, at a corner of Andersonstown in West Belfast, a man in a parka who had been the officer commanding of the Provisional IRA's Belfast Brigade for 14 months stood at the wall of a house with a radio that did not officially belong to him and waited. His name was Brendan Hughes. He was 24 years old. He was waiting for confirmation that 3 British Army intelligence operations had been simultaneously terminated within a 6-mile radius of where he stood. 2 miles to the west, a green van bearing the false signage of a civilian laundry was about to be ambushed on a housing estate cul-de-sac. 4 miles to the northeast, a Belfast brothel on the Antrim Road was about to be raided by a 4-man IRA squad. 1 mile south of where Hughes stood, an MRF office on College Square East was about to be hit. All 3 had been compromised by the same counterintelligence cell. All 3 were going down inside the same 40 minutes. The man on the corner had given the order. That is one way to tell the story of the morning of October 2nd, 1972. It is the story Hughes himself told on a series of tape reels recorded between 2001 and 2002 in a Belfast back room to a former IRA prisoner named Anthony McIntyre for an oral history project archived at Boston College and embargoed until the contributors were dead. Hughes died on the 16th of February 2008 in Belfast City Hospital of a chest infection that progressed to coma. The embargo lifted. The tapes emerged. The journalist Ed Maloney published them in 2010 in a book called Voices from the Grave. The officer commanding had finally given his version of the morning, and the morning had its inside narrator. This is that narrator's morning. To understand the man on the corner, you have to start in the lower falls. Brendan Hughes was born in 1948 to a Catholic Irish nationalist family on a terraced street a few minutes' walk from the Falls Road in West Belfast. His mother died when he was a boy. His father raised the children in a flat at the heart of a community where the police were a foreign presence, and the British state was a flag flown over somebody else's parliament. In the late 1960s, Hughes joined the British Merchant Navy. He told McIntyre decades later that he did it to take a financial burden off his father. The man who would order the destruction of an arm of British military intelligence in October 1972 spent his late teenage years moving cargo across the Atlantic on British-flagged ships. He saw apartheid South Africa. He told McIntyre he became a socialist there. He came home in 1969 to a city that was burning. In August 1969, after months of civil rights marches and loyalist counter-protest, Catholic streets in West Belfast were attacked, burned out and emptied. Refugees crossed into the Falls. The Irish Republican Army, which had spent the 1960s drifting toward Marxist politics and away from the gun, was found to have abandoned its constituency. A piece of graffiti appeared on a wall on Leeson Street. It read, "IRA, I ran away." The split that followed in late 1969 and early 1970 produced the Provisional IRA. Brendan Hughes joined it. He was 21 years old. He was assigned to D Company of the 2nd Battalion, the company that worked the lower falls. The OC of D Company was his older cousin, Charlie Hughes. The boys in the company called themselves the Dogs. In March 1971, Charlie Hughes was killed. He was shot in the lower falls during a feud between the provisional and official wings of the IRA. He was the first provisional volunteer of the Belfast Brigade to die in the Troubles. Brendan Hughes took command of D Company in his cousin's place. He was 22 years old. He had been in the Provisional IRA for less than 2 years. What followed was 18 months of what Hughes, in the Boston interviews, described in a single, uninterrupted sentence. "You would have had a call house," he told McIntyre, "and you might have robbed a bank in the morning, done a float in the afternoon, stuck a bomb and a booby trap out after that, and then maybe had a gun battle or two later that night." That was D Company in 1971 and 1972. That was the operational rhythm of the lower falls. The Provisional IRA was running a campaign on the streets of West Belfast against a regular British army that had arrived in August 1969 expecting to keep the peace, and that found itself by the autumn of 1971 fighting an urban war. The British state's response was a series of escalations. The first was internment. On 9 August 1971, in the operation codenamed Operation Demetrius, the British Army arrested 342 men in pre-dawn raids across Northern Ireland. The men were taken to detention centres and held without trial. By the time the policy ended in December 1975, almost 2,000 people had been interned. Brendan Hughes was not among the 342. He was already on the run. The second escalation was less visible. In the summer of 1971, a brigadier named Frank Kitson, who commanded the 39th Infantry Brigade in Belfast, was given permission to stand up a new unit. Kitson had spent the early 1950s in Kenya, where he had hunted the Land and Freedom Army, the British called them the Mau Mau, by turning captured fighters and using them to operate counter-gangs against their former comrades. In November 1971, Kitson published a book called Low-Intensity Operations. The book formalised the counter-gang doctrine for use against an urban insurgency in a Western democracy. The next year, the British Army would test the doctrine in West Belfast. The unit Kitson stood up was called the Military Reaction Force. The MRF was up to 40 hand-picked soldiers drawn from across the regular army and from special units. It was based at Palace Barracks in Hollywood on the eastern outskirts of the city. Its first commander was a captain named Arthur Watchus. From June 1972, the unit was commanded by a captain named James Hamish McGregor. The unit's operational doctrine was simple. It operated in civilian clothes, in unmarked vehicles, with concealed weapons. It did not fly the flag of the British Army. It did not coordinate with the Royal Ulster Constabulary. It ran its own surveillance, its own informers, and its own targeting. Years later, one former operator told the BBC's Panorama programme what the rules of engagement actually were. "We were not there to act like an army unit," he said. The producers identified him only as Soldier F. "We were there to act like a terror group." That is one MRF operator. There were two ways the MRF gathered intelligence on the IRA. The first was direct surveillance, drive-bys, observation posts, photography. The second was infrastructure. The MRF set up a series of civilian front businesses across Belfast, businesses staffed by undercover soldiers, businesses designed to penetrate Republican neighbourhoods at a level no patrol could reach. There were three fronts in West and North Belfast in the autumn of 1972 that the public record names. The first was the laundry. The Four Square Laundry was a real laundry. It operated out of a depot on the Bournemore Road. It accepted clean clothes from its customers and returned them, on time, at competitive rates. The vans, painted in a green and white livery, made twice-weekly rounds through the Catholic estates of West Belfast. The driver was a soldier of the Royal Engineers. The collector at the front door was a lance corporal of the Women's Royal Army Corps named Sarah Jane Walk, born in Coleraine in County Derry, operating under the cover name Jane. Before the clothes were washed, they were forensically examined. They were tested for explosive residue. They were tested for blood and firearms residue. They were compared to previous loads from the same household. A sudden appearance of new sizes, say a 6-foot man's clothes turning up at the address of a single mother, indicated a Republican on the run was being harboured there. The intelligence was collated and fed to the MRF, and from there to the British Army's Brigade structure in Belfast. The van had a second function. There was a compartment hidden in the roof, and that compartment held a man with a camera. The second front was the brothel. The Gemini Health Studios was a massage parlour at 397 Antrim Road in North Belfast. It was staffed by 4 soldiers of the Women's Royal Army Corps, posing as masseuses, and a small group of contracted prostitutes, some of them imported from the north of England. The clients were the targets. The pattern was simple. The client visited. The encounter was discreetly recorded, and the client was then approached and informed that if he did not start supplying information on the IRA, the recording would arrive at his door. It was a honey trap operation. Volunteers called it the knocking shop. The third front was an office on College Square East in the city centre. Hughes, in the Boston tapes, did not say when his counterintelligence cell first noticed the laundry. He did say what triggered the unravelling. 2 men. The first was Seamus Wright. He was a volunteer in the 2nd Battalion, 25 years old. He had been arrested by the British Army in early 1972 and turned. The Ministry of Defence's own records, partially released after litigation, describe him as a turned terrorist. The records note that he was paid £285 for his work and that he was discharged as unsatisfactory on March 29, 1972. The second was Kevin McKee. He was 17. He had also been arrested, also been turned, and the British Army had set him up in a safe house. The MOD records note that on September 6, 1972, he escaped from protective custody. What happened next is more clearly understood from the IRA's account than from the MOD records. McKee made his way back to West Belfast. He surrendered himself to the Provisional IRA. He was interrogated. So by then was Wright. What the 2 of them told the IRA under interrogation was the laundry, the brothel, and the office, the system, the doctrine, the men running it, the locations of the safe houses. The MOD's own internal assessment, written in the months after, would conclude that McKee almost certainly was the man who blew the operation. The same MOD document notes that the British Army knew, after his escape, that the MRF's largest civilian front operation was compromised. The MRF kept it running for almost 4 more weeks anyway. The Army's own files describe the reason. The operation was such a successful intelligence-gathering operation that nobody at the ministry was willing to shut it down. The IRA's account of the discovery is slightly different from the MOD's. In the Republican account, the laundry was first noticed by a volunteer who realised that the green vans were collecting laundry from households in Catholic streets where no resident remembered hiring them. The volunteer cross-checked the registered Belfast laundry operators. Foursquare did not appear on any of them. The volunteer reported up the chain. The chain ran to Hughes. Probably both threads are true. The intelligence on Foursquare laundry came from observation on the streets and from the interrogations in the safe house. The 2 streams converged. By late September 1972, Brendan Hughes had a complete picture of the MRF's civilian front operation in Belfast. He did not move at once. He waited. He waited because he wanted the strike to be simultaneous. This is the part of the morning that the British state has never publicly described. The British Army's Brigade war diaries for June and August of 1972 are sealed until 2073, a 100-year embargo instead of the standard 30. Whatever the brigade staff in Belfast knew about the operational planning of the strike, they have not told the public. What we know about the planning comes almost entirely from one source: Hughes himself, on the Boston tapes, describing the operation to McIntyre. The decision Hughes described was this: the three fronts had to go down together, in the same morning, inside the same hour. If the strike on the laundry van succeeded, but the brothel and the office got a warning, the operatives at those sites would scatter, and the MRF's infrastructure would survive intact and reorganize within a week. The MRF would simply hire new vans and rent new offices, and the cycle would start again. The only way to permanently break the unit was to hit all three before any of them could call ahead. That meant radios. That meant timing. That meant 3 teams of volunteers, briefed separately, briefed only on their own piece, working from 3 different battalions of the Belfast Brigade. The IRA's 2nd Battalion, Hughes's battalion, would take the van and the office at College Square East. The 3rd Battalion, operating in the New Lodge and the Antrim Road, would take the Gemini Health Studios. The teams did not know about each other. The radios, civilian band, unregistered, were used to coordinate the start of the operation, not its execution. Hughes set the time for the morning of Monday, October 2nd, 1972. At 11:15 that morning, the green Morris laundry van turned off Stewartstown Road into Juniper Park on the Twinbrook estate in West Belfast. In the driver's seat was a sapper of the Royal Engineers named Edward Stewart, known as Ted. He was 20 years old. He had been in Belfast for the better part of a year. He was wearing civilian clothes. He had a pistol on him, but the pistol was concealed. In the roof compartment, depending on which account you read, there were 1 or 2 undercover soldiers with cameras. At the back of the van, walking up to a front door with a bundle of clean folded clothes, was the woman known on operations as Jane. Her real name was Sarah Jane Walk. She was a lance corporal in the Women's Royal Army Corps. She was not armed. The shooting started without warning. What followed at Juniper Park is documented from 3 sides, and they do not agree. The British official record is that a single soldier, sapper Ted Stewart, was killed at the steering wheel of the van by sustained automatic fire. The IRA's account, recorded in Anfoblacht, is that further undercover soldiers were killed in the roof compartment as the van was machine-gunned from the side and the rear. The compartment is real. Whether there were operators in it that morning, and whether they were killed, is something the British state has never confirmed. Sarah Jane Walk was at a door on the estate when the shooting began. The accounts agree on what she did. She ran. She ran into a neighbouring house, screamed that loyalist gunmen were trying to kill her, and asked for help. The household, who took her, plausibly, for a frightened civilian, gave her brandy and a sedative. They sat with her until a plainclothes RUC officer arrived to collect her. She was driven away from Twinbrook in the back of an unmarked car. She survived the morning. The following September, she was awarded the Military Medal for Bravery. The citation did not mention Twinbrook by name. She was the first member of the Women's Royal Army Corps to receive the Military Medal for an undercover operation in Ireland. The MOD has, in the 53 years since, said almost nothing else about her career. Hughes was not at Juniper Park. He was, by the IRA's account and his own, monitoring the strike from a position elsewhere in West Belfast. The radio confirmed, in the minutes that followed, that the van was down and the team had withdrawn cleanly. What was happening at the same hour, 4 miles to the northeast, was the second strike. The Gemini Health Studios at 397 Antrim Road was hit by a 4-man squad of the IRA's 3rd Battalion. The squad walked in through the front door, identified the operatives and opened fire. The Provisional IRA's published account in An Phoblacht states that 2 further MRF members were killed at the parlour that morning. The British official record acknowledges no MRF death at the Antrim Road site. The 4 women of the WRAC who worked there were extracted by the army that afternoon and have never been publicly named. The contracted prostitutes were left to make their own arrangements. The 3rd strike at the same hour hit the office on College Square East. The IRA team arrived and found the rooms largely empty. A bystander was wounded. The office, as an MRF asset, ceased to exist. Inside the same 40 minutes, the largest civilian front operation that British military intelligence had stood up since the end of the Second World War had been comprehensively dismantled by men who were operating in their entirety from inside a 6-square-mile area of one city. By the afternoon, the news had reached the regimental command in Lisburn. By the evening, the operation was being internally written off. The unit had, by every internal British military assessment, lost the city. Hughes, on the Boston tapes, gave the operation 40 minutes from order to confirmation. The MRF, in some form, would survive at the unit level for a further 3 months. By early 1973, the unit was disbanded. Its operating method had been broken. Its replacement, the Special Reconnaissance Unit, was reorganised under the direct control of Headquarters Northern Ireland and was forbidden from using the civilian front concept ever again. The next surveillance unit on the streets of West Belfast would be the 14th Field Intelligence Company, known to its operators as the Detachment, and the Det would never run a laundry van. What happened to Brendan Hughes after the morning of October 2nd, 1972, is also documented, and what happened was hard. By the spring of 1973, Hughes was the second in command of the Belfast Brigade, working under Gerry Adams. The friendship between the 2 men was the central political relationship of his life. On July 19, 1973, Hughes was arrested with Adams and Tom Cahill on the Falls Road. He was taken to Long Kesh. On December 8, 1973, he escaped by rolling himself inside a mattress that was loaded onto a refuse truck. He fled to Dublin and then back into Belfast, where he reorganised the brigade for the better part of 5 months. On 10th May 1974, he was arrested again at a flat in Myrtlefield Park, where the British Army had finally located him on a tip-off. He was found in a room with a submachine gun, 4 rifles, 2 pistols, and several thousand rounds of ammunition. He was sentenced to 15 years. He was, by the autumn of 1974, the new officer commanding of the Belfast Brigade, and an internment centre commander instead of a field commander. Hughes spent the next 12 years in prison. He was, by 1978, the IRA's officer commanding inside the H blocks of HMP Maze. He led the blanket protest. He led the dirty protest. On October 27, 1980, he led 7 IRA prisoners onto the first hunger strike. The strike ran for 53 days. It ended when one of the men, Sean McKenna, approached coma, and the British government's intermediary offered terms that Hughes interpreted as a concession. The terms turned out to be less than what the strikers had been told. The 1981 hunger strike, the one that killed Bobby Sands and the 9 other men who followed him, was a direct consequence of the 1980 strike's collapse. Hughes opposed the 1981 strike. He thought it was a tactical mistake. He outlived the men who died in it by 27 years, and he never stopped feeling that he had failed them. He was released in 1986. He returned to Belfast. He stayed initially, by his own account, at Gerry Adams's house. What followed was a slow, painful political drift. Hughes worked in low-paid jobs. He saw the Republican movement, the movement he had given his 20s to, drift toward electoral politics and the negotiating table. In 1994, the IRA called the ceasefire. In 1998, the Belfast Agreement was signed. Hughes did not accept the Belfast Agreement. He believed that the political settlement was a defeat dressed as a victory. He believed the leadership had used the personal loyalty of the volunteers in the streets and the prisons to bring an organisation that had, by its own self-understanding, been engaged in a war of national liberation to an accommodation with the British state inside the partitioned Northern Ireland it had set out to abolish. His public criticism began modestly and grew. By the early 2000s, he was an open dissident. He said on the record that working-class Catholics and Protestants had emerged from the agreement with what he called, in one famous sentence, "got fuck all." The break with Adams was the hardest part. Hughes had loved Adams. He told McIntyre on the tapes, "I believed 100% in Adams. If Jerry had told me that tomorrow was Monday when I knew it was Sunday, I would have thought twice." He told McIntyre something else on the tapes that did not become public until after Hughes was dead. He named Jerry Adams as the man who had ordered the abduction and execution of a Belfast widow named Jean McConville in December 1972, on the grounds that she was a British Army informer. Adams has denied this allegation consistently in every public forum and was arrested in May 2014 in connection with the McConville inquiry. He was released without charge. The Hughes-Adams dispute is the central political feature of the last decade of Hughes's life. It is on the record. It is in court documents. It is in the Boston tapes. It is something the script can describe but cannot adjudicate. What is also on the record, and what does not appear in the British state's official history, is what Brendan Hughes did between 2001 and his death in 2008. He sat with Anthony McIntyre in a Belfast back room for an oral history project archived at Boston College, and he talked for hours. He named names. He confessed operations he had ordered. He confessed regrets he had carried for 30 years. He confessed Bloody Friday. He had been, by his own admission, the operational commander of the bombing that killed 9 people on July 21, 1972. And he confessed the morning of October 2, 1972. He died on February 16, 2008, of pneumonia and heart failure after a week in a coma at the Belfast City Hospital. He was 59 years old. His ashes were scattered at 3 places he had chosen: his parents' grave, the ruins of his cottage in the Cooley Mountains, and a memorial to D Company on the Falls Road. The Boston tapes were sealed at the time of his death. The Police Service of Northern Ireland, acting on the McConville investigation, applied for them in 2011. After 3 years of litigation in the United States courts, the tapes, 11 of them, were released to the PSNI in 2014. Adams was arrested. Ivor Bell was charged. The case against Bell was eventually dropped. The case against Adams was never brought. What did get into the public record was the version of the morning of October 2, 1972, that has stood since. Brendan Hughes ordered the strike. Brendan Hughes timed it. Brendan Hughes confirmed it from a corner in Andersonstown. The military reaction force was disbanded inside 3 months of the morning. In November 2013, the BBC's Panorama programme broadcast a documentary called Britain's Secret Terror Force. 7 former MRF operators spoke to the reporter John Ware. 3 appeared on camera, faces blurred and voices altered. They admitted that the unit had carried out drive-by shootings of unarmed Catholic civilians who were not in the IRA. They named 10 individual cases. The programme prompted a referral to the Chief Constable of Northern Ireland. In December 2015, the PSNI launched Operation Everson, the investigation into MRF activity between April and September 1972. In February 2024, the Public Prosecution Service for Northern Ireland announced that a former MRF operator, designated Soldier F, would be prosecuted for the murder of a 44-year-old father of 6 named Patrick McVeigh, who had been shot at the junction of Finahi Road North and Riverdale Park South on the 13th of May 1972 by men in a passing unmarked car. 4 other men were wounded in the same incident. The forensic tests on the dead man and the wounded men were negative. None of them were in the IRA. Brendan Hughes died in a tower block flat in Beechmount in February 2008. He had been, by the last decade of his life, estranged from the Republican leadership he had spent his 20s helping into existence. The Boston College tapes were sealed at the time of his death. They emerged later. They confirm, in his own voice, that the 2nd of October 1972 strikes were coordinated, were ordered, were his. The Military Reaction Force is the unit this channel covered in its previous video. The laundry van, our previous video opened on. The named dead, the previous video named. The man on the corner who ordered the van put out of business. At 24 years old, with a radio that did not belong to him, in a parka, in a junction in Andersonstown, has never appeared in a documentary about the morning his decision ended an arm of the British state. The audience asked for that documentary in a 5-like comment on the previous video, naming Hughes by name. This is that documentary.